If you've ever felt the absolute, crushing silence of true isolation, you know it's not peaceful. It's a living thing. It breathes, it presses, and it amplifies the dread until it's a physical weight on your chest. Before we enter this silent chamber with Lena, I'd love to know where this story finds you tonight. Drop your city and country in the comments. Knowing where you are watching from connects us all to this moment of desperate hope. For Lena Vasiliev, 17 years old and specializing in the tactile world, the silence of the remote northern Michigan cabin in November 2012 was the first thing that paralyzed her. It was cold here, the air dry and heavy, smelling faintly of old varnish and pine sap. She was no longer on the bustling campus street in Ann Arbor. She was in a box, a meticulously crafted wooden box. She was not on the floor, but strapped to a chair, her left wrist secured by a heavy steel cuff and chain. The chain was short, allowing her to reach a small, sturdy table, but nothing more. Lena, who processed the world to haptical memory, the sense of touch, pressure, and texture, instinctively closed her eyes, blocking out the sterile panic visual and forcing her fingers to explore. The wood of the chair was rough-hewn pine, sanded smooth, but the back was slightly split near the dowel joint. The steel cuff was cold, thick, and surprisingly heavy, radiating a temperature lower than the ambient air. It was a professional industrial cuff, not a novelty. Her captor, a man named Alistair Kaine, stood before her. He was tall, thin, and impeccably dressed for a man in a remote Michigan cabin, wearing a tweed jacket that smelled faintly of old books and something metallic. His eyes, magnified slightly by thin silver-rimmed glasses, were unnervingly calm. "The key to comfort, Lena," he said, his voice a low, even murmur that held no hint of anger, "is understanding the parameters. You are safe, you are warm, but you are fixed."
He was a craftsman. As he spoke, his hands rested on the back of a heavy built-in dresser adjacent to the chair. Lena's senses instantly registered the smooth, polished cherrywood of the dresser. High-quality material, but installed with an amateur's haste. She noted the small gap between the wood molding of the dresser and the plasterboard wall. It was uneven, slightly wider on the left. Dr. Kaine continued his monologue, laying out the rules of his control. He spoke of his need for structure, his desire for peace, and his absolute assurance that her capture was flawless. He mistook her deep, quiet concentration with shock. He believed he had broken her. He believed her terror made her blind. He explained his departure. "I have to return to the university. A lecture I cannot miss. 2 hours, perhaps less." His arrogance was built on the immutability of his constraints. The steel, the thick walls, the isolation of the woods. He turned toward a back door, which was heavy and solid, unlike the main door. Lena heard the dull clink of keys and noted the specific feel of his tweed cuff brushing against the cold, smooth brass of the doorknob. The metallic smell from his jacket, she realized, was linseed oil, the scent of a meticulous woodworker. He opened the door and stepped through. She heard the heavy bolt slide home, followed by the distant crunch of tires on frozen gravel. Then silence. True, absolute silence. Lena was alone. Her mind, no longer restrained by the mask of terror, surged forward. Her hands, still tied by thick, cheap nylon rope, were her only lens into the world. It was time to build her haptic map. Lena's immediate focused dread began to mutate into a hot electric surge of clarity. She had 2 hours, maybe less. She had to use her gift. When Lena was a child, she could identify furniture blindfolded simply by running her hands over the wood grain. She could tell the tension of a wire, the age of a bolt, or the slightest flaw in a weld simply by touch. This wasn't magic. It was a lifetime of heightened tactile feedback. She started with her immediate surroundings. The nylon ropes securing her hands were tough, but the cheap knot was already starting to loosen with her relentless, minute pressure. She worked her thumbs, finding the direction of the weave, pulling with controlled, precise force. While working the knot, she explored her prison with her feet. The floor was old, painted pine, and she felt the grain of the wood beneath her thin socks. The floorboard squeaked in 3 specific places, near the center of the room, near the front window, and crucially near the heavy built-in dresser that was her anchor point. This meant the subfloor was uneven, revealing a weakness in the cabin's original construction. She turned her attention to the dresser. This was the ultimate prison. It was a 6-drawer cherrywood unit, deep and solid. She strained the chain, reaching the front edge of the cabinet, running her fingertips along the bottom edge where the molding met the baseboard. She confirmed the flaw she'd noticed earlier. The gap was indeed wider on the left, an inconsistency that screamed of a quick, unpolished installation. Her most critical assessment was of the cuff and chain on her wrist. The steel was heavy, the weld flawless. There was no way to slip out or break the chain. However, running her finger along the metal surface of the cuff, she felt a microscopic seam where the lock mechanism met the steel body. It was a subtle, almost invisible hairline fracture in the metal's texture, a weak point the original manufacturer had tried to hide. She needed a tool. Her eyes scanned the room, but the walls were bare. The desk was cleared, and the nightstand held only a heavy, unmoving lamp. Her gaze landed on the floor near her right foot. The old pine floorboards had been sanded and varnished, but years of heavy traffic had resulted in fine, thin wood slivers peeling up near the baseboard. With great effort, pushing with the heel of her shoe, she managed to chip loose a sliver about 3 inches long. It was thin, rigid, and fragile. It was a tool. She returned to her hands. The knot was loosening. Finally, with a sharp pull, the cheap nylon rope snapped free. Her hands were raw, red and shaking from adrenaline, but they were free. She used her thumb to clean the wood sliver, refining its tip until it was sharp and smooth. The game had begun. She focused on the hairline fracture and the steel cuff, a flaw measured in microns, visible only to her sense of touch. If she could deepen that fracture, she might compromise the internal locking pin, but she knew instinctively, with the cold certainty of touch, that the wood sliver wouldn't be strong enough. She had to find a different angle of attack. The answer, she knew, lay in the dresser.
Lena moved cautiously, still dragging the heavy chain attached to her wrist. The steel cuff was now a constant, chilling companion, its weight a reminder of her time limit. Her attention shifted from the cuff to the man who had installed it. What did Dr. Kaine value more, security or aesthetics? She had cataloged his scent, linseed oil, confirming his background as a woodworker. This meant he likely rushed the structural, invisible parts of his cage, focusing only on the final visible polish. She pressed her ear to the polished cherry wood of the dresser. It was solid, expensive, but the back panel vibrated ever so slightly when she tapped it. It wasn't lagged into the studs. It was anchored into the drywall. She turned her attention to the rest of the room, feeling with her fingers. She traced the contours of the wooden windowsill. It was smooth, but the paint had cracked near the frame, indicating the window itself was old and likely swelled shut by humidity. No escape there.
She returned to the dresser, running her hand along the base molding near the floor. Her fingers found the gap she had seen earlier, the structural flaw. She pushed the tip of the wood sliver into the gap. It slid in easily, hitting a smooth, non-porous surface, a nail head. She pushed harder, sliding the sliver along the length of the molding, mapping the attachment points. There were 4 points along the 7-foot length of the molding where the sliver struck metal. This was not enough to hold a load-bearing dresser. A proper installation would have used lag bolts drilled into the studs, spaced every 16 inches. Dr. Kaine, the meticulous craftsman, had valued a clean finish over true security. But what was holding the dresser to the wall?
She found her answer by touch, pushing her hand into the dark, cold space between the dresser's side and the wall. Her fingers felt the rough, gypsum texture of drywall, then traced the line of a series of large, heavy but thin-headed screws. They weren't lag bolts, which require a hexagonal head and a washer. They were simple Phillips head drywall screws, designed for hanging heavy art, not restraining a captive. They had been sunk quickly, leaving the screws vulnerable to lateral pressure. This was the true flaw. Suddenly, she heard a muffled, low sound, distinct from the rhythmic hum of the distant furnace. It was a car engine idling. Had he returned? Panic surged, cold and immediate. She froze, straining her ears, but the sound faded. It was merely a passing vehicle on a remote road, but it served as a brutal reminder of the ticking clock. She had to work fast. She needed a tool strong enough to get beneath the flathead of the drywall screw and leverage it out. The wood sliver was too weak. The metal corner piece was in the desk, too far away. She scanned the small table near her chair. On it lay a stack of blank index cards and a small, heavy wooden bookend carved in the shape of a stylized pine cone. Lena reached for it, her fingers running over the smooth, dense texture of the mahogany. This was a piece of high-quality, solid wood. It was heavier than it looked. This was her hammer. This was her lever. She knew what she had to do. The sound would be catastrophic, but she had no other choice.
Lena grabbed the mahogany bookend. The sheer weight of the object felt dangerous and empowering in her hands. She knew that any loud sound in this sound-deadened room would announce her escape attempt to anyone within earshot, or, worse, signal her failure to Dr. Kaine should he be pulling into the driveway. She decided to start the destruction where it would be most effective. The cherrywood molding at the base of the dresser concealed the crucial attachment points, the vulnerable drywall screws. Holding the heavy bookend tightly in her freed right hand, she swung it hard against the base of the wood molding near the largest gap. Crack! The sound was shockingly loud, shattering the oppressive silence. It was the sound of beautiful, polished wood splintering, giving way to violence. Lena instantly dropped the bookends, pressing herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening desperately for any car engine, any door opening. Nothing. Just a distant, constant hum of the cabin's electrical system and the drumming of her own fear. She had to commit. She picked up the bookend and struck the same spot again, harder. Thump! Scrack! The molding split, tearing away a large, ragged piece of cherrywood. She had created an opening. Peering into the cavity, she could now clearly see the wide, flat heads of the Phillips drywall screws sunk into the plasterboard. They were exactly as her haptic memory had predicted. Not sturdy lag bolts, but screws designed to hold weight against a wall, not lateral force. She had a new problem. She still lacked a flathead screwdriver capable of removing the screws, and the bookend was too blunt. She needed to rip them out, not turn them.
She looked down at her chain. The heavy industrial cuff was still locked tightly to her wrist, but the chain itself was long and thick. This steel, this tool of her captivity, had to become the instrument of her freedom. A daring, almost impossible plan formed in her mind, combining leverage, the weakness of the drywall, and the sheer tensile strength of the chain. She used the remaining piece of the cherrywood molding as a wedge, jamming it into the drywall just above the exposed screws. Then she took the heavy steel chain, pulled it taut, and wrapped the final thick link around the wedge. She was essentially turning her body into the fulcrum or catastrophic lever. The drywall was the weakest point in the equation, and the chain was the strongest. She placed her free hand on the wall, steadying herself, and with a grunt that tore from her throat, she began to twist her body away from the wall. The heavy cuff bit into her wrist, but she ignored the pain, channeling every ounce of her fear and desperate strength into the twist. The chain became rigid, a steel wire tightening around the wooden wedge. Then, slowly, with a thickening, grinding sound, the sound of stripped plaster and tearing paper, the wall began to give. The heads of the drywall screws dug into the crumbling gypsum, pulling the anchors out of the board. The sound was terrible, a drawn-out, agonizing process of structural defeat. Lena closed her eyes, twisting harder, imagining the plaster turning to dust. With a final desperate heave, the entire section of the dresser's back panel, along with its screws, pulled violently away from the wall, leaving a catastrophic gaping hole in the plasterboard. The dresser remained upright, but the chain, now secured to a dangling section of the wall, was free of its heavy anchor. The chain, cuff, and a large ragged piece of drywall ripped from the wall clattered to the floor. Lena stood, swaying on her feet, dizzy with adrenaline and the sudden overwhelming sensation of partial freedom. The heavy piece of drywall, still bolted to the cuff, was her new, clumsy anchor. She had to move, now.
The wall piece was bulky and heavy, slowing her down and making an impossible amount of noise with every clumsy step. Lena didn't waste a second trying to detach the drywall. She knew the metal was still deeply embedded. She had to take the wall with her. She scrambled out of the bedroom through the door Dr. Kaine had used, the heavy piece of wall dragging and scraping behind her, leaving a dusty white streak across the finished wood floor of the hallway. She navigated the silent house using her spatial memory, sensing the slight drop in temperature near the front of the house and the change in floor material from polished wood to cold, unforgiving slate in the entryway. Her destination was the main exit. She reached the front door, a heavy, solid oak structure. She felt the surface, 2 locks, a standard knob lock, and a deadbolt. Her fingers, still trembling, worked on the knob lock. It turned with a satisfying soft click. The deadbolt, however, was massive. She ran her fingers over the smooth, cold brass. It was too deep, too sturdy to tamper with. She looked down at the floor, frantically searching for a new tool. Her eyes landed on a small woven rug near the entryway, a cheap, thin rug with a rubberized backing. Useless. But then she saw it, tucked beneath the edge of the rug, a pair of Dr. Kaine's heavy, worn leather gloves, the kind used for yard work, left carelessly by the door. She snatched them up. In the pocket, she found a single, sharp object, a heavy, flat-ended house key. It was not the long, square-headed key for the deadbolt she had catalogued, but a common interior key. Useless for the external door, but the metal was thick and rigid. She returned to the deadbolt, sliding the flat edge of the house key into the tiny gap between the bolt's tumbler and the brass plate. She tried to apply leverage, but the key bent slightly. The deadbolt held fast. Frustration, raw and hot, welled up. She was 2 feet from freedom, and the single, simple lock was winning. She looked at the key again, then at the nearby wall. The wall was thin here, and she could feel the cold, rigid surface of an air duct running vertically just beneath the plaster. A new, reckless plan formed. She couldn't get through the door, but she could get through the wall, using the air duct as her path. She hammered the thick, flat end of the house key against the thin drywall near the duct. The sound was a loud, desperate pummel as she fought the plaster. The key was a poor tool, but the drywall was weak. She widened the hole until her hand could slip inside the cavity. She felt the cold, hard metal of the ductwork. She pushed and shoved, tearing the metal away from the plaster, creating a jagged, tight opening big enough for her head. The cold air pouring from the duct was a relief, but the opening was still too small. She pulled back, knowing she couldn't squeeze through the duct with the heavy chain and drywall piece attached to her wrist. She had to get out the front door. She returned to the deadbolt, staring at the brass plate, and then she realized the truth. Dr. Kaine was a craftsman who hated clutter. He would not have 2 identical keys. She had to go back to the bedroom. The key she needed was in the other lock. The thought of going back into the prison room sent a wave of nausea through Lena, but her logic was absolute. The long, silver, square-headed key she had catalogued belonged to the heaviest, most secure lock on the premises, the thick-gauge steel lock on the internal door Dr. Kaine had used to exit. She dragged the heavy drywall and chain back down the hallway, her ragged breathing the only sound. She reached the heavy, windowless wooden door at the back of the house. Her haptic memory confirmed the feel of the doorknob, cold, smooth brass, and the lock, a simple, heavy deadbolt. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. She closed her eyes and extended her wrist, feeling the texture of the steel cuff again. Focus on the flaw. Suddenly, she remembered the photograph, a picture she had not consciously noticed when Dr. Kaine was speaking. On the wall opposite her chair, there had been a framed print, an abstract piece. She hadn't cared about the art, but she remembered the specific texture of the oak frame. She realized with a jolt that the cuff on her wrist was not attached to a standard lock, but was secured by a small keyed padlock, which was then attached to the chain. The master key to all his locks, including one on her wrist, was not what she needed. She needed the key to this specific deadbolt.
She remembered Dr. Kaine's brief pause before opening this door. He had retrieved something from his tweed jacket pocket. She searched the floor around the door frame with her feet, then her hands. She felt the smooth, cold surface of the slate tile, and then, near the baseboard, something small, metallic and ridged. It was a key, not the long, square-headed key to the front deadbolt, but a small, circular brass key. Lena's fingers, bleeding and raw, snatched it up. She shoved it into the lock of the back door, twisted hard, and heard the beautiful, definitive snick of the lock yielding. She didn't open the door. She was still chained. She turned and ran back to the front of the house, stopping at the main entrance deadbolt. She shoved the circular brass key into the front deadbolt. It was too small. Despair was a cold hand gripping her heart. She was running out of time. She had wasted the only key she had found, and the front deadbolt remained unyielding. She began to cry, silent, racking sobs of pure failure, when her fingers, still gripping the front deadbolt, felt a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of wood lodged deep inside the keyhole. Dr. Kaine and the woodworker had deliberately placed a splinter of wood into the secondary deadbolt lock to prevent a standard key from working.
In a final act of desperation, she used the small, flat end of the discarded house key and the strength of her forearm to punch the wood splinter deeper into the lock mechanism. She was risking the entire lock, but she was out of options. With a final, terrible blow, the splinter jammed home. She inserted the circular brass key she had found. It was still the wrong size, but with the internal mechanism now damaged by the splinter, she twisted with all her strength. The lock groaned, the internal pins compromised, and then, with a grinding metallic tear, the deadbolt yielded. The front door was open. She burst out onto the front porch. The cold November air hit her lungs like ice water. The dense woods were dark. The only sound, the terrible scraping of the drywall anchor dragging across the wooden porch. She saw the driveway, empty, but she had to move. She ran, dragging the heavy chain and wall section behind her toward the low, distant hissing sound of a freeway she had cataloged days ago on her drive here. Lena ran for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the steel chain and the heavy drywall acting as a rhythmic, agonizing anchor. Her bare hands gripped the chain, pulling the cumbersome weight through the thick, frozen undergrowth of the Michigan woods. She ignored the tearing pain in her wrist, focused only on the sound, the faint, rhythmic roar of the highway. When she finally burst out of the tree line onto the shoulder of a service road, she saw the lights of a small, brightly lit roadside motel and diner. She stumbled toward the entrance, a terrifying apparition, a teenage girl covered in mud and plaster dust, her eyes wild with terror, dragging a chain and a chunk of wood and plasterboard. The motel manager, an older woman named Carol, froze, then immediately rushed to her, wrapping her in a thick, rough wool blanket. The police were called instantly. When Detective Sergeant Ava Torres arrived, she was prepared for hysterics, for trauma, for a vague, unreliable witness. She was not prepared for Lena Vasiliev. "My name is Lena Vasiliev," she whispered, her voice husky and weak, but her delivery was clear, precise, and unwavering. "I was held by Dr. Alistair Kaine. He is a former woodworker. The cabin is cherrywood and plasterboard, located off the old M119 near the third marker past the defunct lumberyard." Detective Torres stared, stunned. Lena didn't stop there. He is meticulous, but arrogant, Lena continued, her hand still shaking, reaching out to describe the invisible. The dresser is cherrywood, but it was anchored to the wall with Phillips head drywall screws, not lag bolts. I know because the tension of the screw head against the plaster was uneven and easily compromised by lateral pressure.
She described Dr. Kaine with a terrifying, intimate detail. He wore a silver watch with a highly textured, woven leather band. Not smooth, but with a fine, almost cross-hatched feel. His jacket smelled of linseed oil and mahogany sawdust. She identified the flaw in the front door lock. He inserted a tiny splinter of pine into the keyhole to prevent standard entry, an old woodworker's trick to defeat a simple lock. Lena's testimony was not a story of fear. It was a forensic report delivered by the body itself. She had mapped the entire cabin through touch, temperature, and texture. She had not only escaped, she had memorized the structural and psychological weaknesses of her captor. Detective Torres had never encountered anything like it. This was not the testimony of a victim clinging to fragments. This was the testimony of a mind that had systematically disassembled its prison. The actionable intelligence Lena provided was a flash flood of data that turned a blind investigation into an immediate, high-precision manhunt. Detective Torres's team cross-referenced the name Dr. Alistair Kaine with property records near the M119 and with former employees of local lumber mills. The combination of the name, the location near the defunct mill, and the specific, unique odor of linseed oil and mahogany sawdust on Kaine's jacket, which Lena had described, led them immediately to the remote cabin property. Less than 2 hours after Lena's escape, a tactical team surrounded the cabin. Dr. Kaine, who had just returned from his lecture at the university, was walking toward his door when the sirens erupted. He was arrested immediately, carrying a small leather briefcase and a look of absolute, soul-shattering disbelief. His flawless, secure world had been brought down by a girl whose sense of touch was sharper than his own craftsmanship. The search of the cabin provided chilling confirmation of Lena's entire account. The bedroom door lay splintered, the dresser was visibly torn from the drywall, and the broken wood splinter was still jammed in the front deadbolt. More critically, in a separate, hidden workshop, they found the trophies. A set of car keys belonging to a young woman missing from Anayuba 3 years prior, a silver ring engraved with initials, and a small, worn leather wallet. Lena Vasiliev's resilience had not just saved her own life. Her meticulous haptic blueprint had given police the key to unlocking multiple cold cases in northern Michigan.
Lena's reunion with her mother, who was flown in immediately, was a powerful collision of terror and pride. When they finally embraced, her mother didn't just feel her daughter's fragile body, she felt the unyielding, humming strength of her spirit. "You came home, Lena," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You did what you always do. You felt the flaw." Lena faced a long, necessary path of healing, but the experience had not broken her. It had profoundly reinforced the core truth of her life. The greatest weapon against the brutal, calculating evil of the world is not physical strength, but the disciplined, perceptive power of the human mind. She had been chained, but she had never been truly captive. She had simply been a witness, meticulously gathering evidence until the moment she could use it to walk free.